UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson tests positive for the coronavirus and is now in self-isolation. He becomes the first world leader to contract COVID-19, but has insisted he will continue to lead the government from isolation. Spain experiences its deadliest 24 hours with 769 deaths linked to COVID-19. Fatalities up nearly to 5,000 with over 60,000 confirmed cases. The United States surpasses China as the country with the most coronavirus cases in the world. This as Chinese Premier Xi Jinping calls for a unified response between the two nations. Hello and thank you for joining us in the France 24 newsroom. I'm Simon Harding. We start in the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has tested positive for COVID-19. The UK PM becomes the first head of state to contract the virus and is now in self-isolation, though Johnson has said that he will still lead the government during his time in quarantine. The Prime Minister has since put up a video on Twitter explaining what happened. Here is an extract.
Hi folks, I want to bring you up to speed with something that's happening today, which is that I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus, that's to say a temperature and a persistent cough. And on the advice of the chief medical officer, I've taken a test that has come out positive. So I am working from home, I'm self-isolating, and that's entirely the right thing to do. But be in no doubt that I can continue, thanks to the wizardry of modern technology, to communicate with all my top team to lead the national fight back against coronavirus.
Well, earlier on, I spoke with France 24's Catherine Nicholson in the UK, who told us the news was a big blow for Boris Johnson and indeed the UK government.
Just a matter of days ago, Boris Johnson was live on television giving a briefing to the nation about coronavirus, where he said that he was still shaking hands with people who had been confirmed as having coronavirus. He said that you simply need to wash your hands a little bit more often. As we know, on Monday of this week, Boris Johnson then drastically changed the United Kingdom's response, bringing it much more closely in line with that of France, for example, telling people that they really must stay at home now unless it is absolutely essential to go out. Reasons including going to undertake essential work, going for essential medical visits, but really encouraging people as much as possible to stay home. It ought to be said, Boris Johnson himself has not been following that advice of staying home. The British Parliament was up and running until the close of play on Wednesday this week. Boris Johnson attended Prime Minister's questions with, as we know, many members of Parliament in the House of Commons around him. He also has been speaking and in close contact with his ministers. Perhaps they themselves might be tested now that he has been tested positive for this. We know that the British Health Minister was tested positive for COVID-19 just a couple of weeks ago as well. As you said, Boris Johnson is now the most high-profile political leader in the world to have tested positive for coronavirus. And this does raise questions about what would happen if he were to get more severe symptoms, be unable to work. We've been told that his foreign minister, Dominic Raab, is ready and waiting, if needed, to step into his shoes. But as we saw at this point, Boris Johnson says he is continuing on with his work.
Well, we can also tell you that the UK's Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has also tested positive, whilst other cabinet members who could have been in contact with Boris Johnson are going into isolation at home. Spain has just lived through its deadliest 24 hours since the coronavirus pandemic hit the country. Health authorities announced that 769 people had passed away, with a total number of cases rocketing to nearly 60,000. There are now almost 5,000 deaths in Spain, with medical staff and infrastructure stretched to breaking point. Earlier on, I spoke to France 24's Sarah Morris in Madrid, who told us the morale was very somber.
This comes as a particular blow because the Spaniards have discovered that the government bought a series of faulty tests from a Chinese company. Basically, the tests were supposed to be super quick tests that could tell whether somebody had the virus within 15 minutes, and they were all designed to help detect whether health workers, for instance, should stop working and were at risk. The government had initially said it bought 9,000 of those tests, and today it was revealed that 50,000 of those tests were bought from a supplier that the Chinese government then revealed was not on its authorised list of suppliers. The Spanish government has defended itself, saying that those tests were bought from a Spanish company that obtained them from that Chinese supplier, and the government has been saying just how difficult it is to get hold of protective equipment, super testing at a time like this. They said that there is a genuine war with different countries trying to obtain that vital equipment, but nevertheless a deep blow as these figures rise. What we have heard from Fernando Simon, who's in charge of this health emergency, is he said that although the number has risen of deaths, he says that the percentage increase is virtually the same as over the last few days. He says there is signs of stabilisation, and the health authorities still expect a peak in the figures next week.
The United States is now officially the new epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic, with over 82,000 confirmed cases, surpassing China. The states of Washington, California and Louisiana have seen a sharp rise in positive tests, and there are concerns that Louisiana, and in particular the city of New Orleans, could be next to be hit by a major wave. The city is facing looming shortages of supplies, staff and sickbeds. For the moment, though, New York remains the worst affected area. Alison Sargent has the latest on the situation there.
New York City's mayor calls it the epicenter of the epicenter. Dozens line up in front of Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, waiting for hours in the hope of being tested for COVID-19.
Sí, hace ya 4 días que tiene tos y fiebre. Entonces, ayer venimos, pero había mucha gente, entonces nos regresaron a la casa. Entonces hoy estoy aquí desde las 7 de la mañana haciendo fila para él.
The number of hospitalized patients in New York City jumped by 40% in just a day on Thursday. City officials say the emergency number 911 has been overwhelmed.
Over 6,000 calls a day, which are breaking records. We didn't have this many calls on 9/11. So if we're doing 6,000 today, it's going to be 8,000 tomorrow. More and more people are going to call. It's a sustained impact like this we've never dealt with.
Cases are also surging in New Orleans, where just a month ago these streets were packed with crowds celebrating Mardi Gras. Health officials say the festival was the perfect storm for the spread of the virus, and the governor is pleading for residents to stay home after cases in Louisiana rose by 28% in 24 hours.
There is no reason why the things that you see coming out of Italy wouldn't happen here in Louisiana if people don't engage seriously in these mitigation measures.
The federal government has agreed to send 2 military field hospitals to Louisiana, like those being set up in New York. They include some 700 personnel and nearly 300 beds, and will be ready to begin treating patients in New York City on Monday.
Well, President Trump has said that he has much respect for China after a conversation with President Xi Jinping. China has called for cooperation throughout the world to fight against the pandemic at a virtual meeting of G20 nations, where world leaders pledged to work together to fight the virus and, importantly, to inject €4.5 trillion into the global economy in a bid to avoid a recession. Emerald Maxwell has this.
Breaking the ice with a trans-Pacific phone call. Following their G20 video conference on Thursday, President Xi Jinping has phoned US President Donald Trump because he is, quote, very worried about the epidemic in the United States. Xi called for the US to improve bilateral relations with China after clashes in recent weeks over the coronavirus. It came as the World Health Organization said the US is expected to become the new epicenter of the pandemic. Trump tweeted that the call was a very good conversation.
China has been through much and has developed a strong understanding of the virus. We are working closely together. Much respect.
Trump has angered Beijing in recent weeks by repeatedly referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus and attacking China's lack of transparency. Xi said China has been sharing information about the epidemic and sending medical supplies to needy countries, including the US. Like American hospitals now, China's medical system struggled to contain the coronavirus just 2 months ago. But draconian lockdowns have drastically eased the epidemic there. China has reported just one local coronavirus case in 3 days.
新增确诊病例55例，其中境外输入54例，本土病例1例，为浙江病例。
Out of fear that these imported cases could reignite the outbreak, Beijing has ordered airlines to cut about 90% of international flights and temporarily suspended entry to China for foreigners, even those with residence permits.
The coronavirus pandemic is particularly worrying in war-torn countries. Earlier this week, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called on all conflict-hit areas to stop fighting in a bid to tackle the virus. If we look at the situation in Syria, the health organization is warning of a slow-moving tsunami heading towards Idlib province and that it's sending testing kits to what are some of the world's most vulnerable populations. We are now joined by Armin Georgian from our International Affairs Desk. Armin, thank you very much for joining us live here on France 24. Tell us a little bit more about the risk that Syrians are facing.
Well, Syria has the world's biggest population of internally displaced people. The country has been at war for 9 years, and there are particularly 2 areas in the country which are of great concern to aid agencies. One is Idlib province itself, where civilians are trapped because for several months now the Syrian government has been trying to retake control of that province. And the other area of great concern is northwestern Syria, where civilians are also trapped because they fled the fighting in Idlib. They went to the Turkish border, but they couldn't actually enter Turkey because that border is closed. So they're trapped out in the open. And that's, of course, a huge problem. There's no question of social distancing in tents. There's no question of washing hands when the people are barely able to give themselves a wash once a week. So that's a huge hazard. And as for inside Idlib province itself, of course, that government offensive has led to many hospitals being destroyed. So if somebody does fall ill, there is very likely not to be an available hospital, or if there is one, there may well not be an intensive care unit or a ventilator. So all in all, the early warning and alert response network says that 1.2 million people could become infected with coronavirus in Idlib.
And Armin, as I was saying earlier, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has called for all war-torn conflicts to stop. But what was the international response to his statement?
Well, politically, there hasn't been much of a response in Syria, and it's very hard to see the Syrian government and all these factions that it's fighting actually coming to a politically negotiated solution at this point in time. However, the dynamic may change depending on how coronavirus actually spreads in the areas that the Syrian government controls. The Syrian government has imposed a ban on traveling between different provinces in Syria that the government controls. So it's clearly very worried about spread. But if there is a spread of the virus, then obviously a lot of energy and focus will have to be placed on dealing with that situation affecting civilians. Therefore, there might possibly be a lull in the fighting. But overall, in terms of a nationwide ceasefire, which is what UN Secretary General Guterres called for, that seems pretty unlikely in Syria at the moment.
Armin Georgian from our International Affairs Desk, thank you very much for those updates. And finally, in other world news, Mount Merapi in Indonesia, the country's most active volcano, has erupted for a second time this year, shooting a 5,000-metre high ash column into the sky. The impressive footage showed ash and sand covering areas several kilometres away from the peak of the rumbling crater near Indonesia's cultural capital, Yogyakarta. Despite the eruption, authorities haven't raised the alert level in Merapi. The volcano's last major eruption in 2010 killed more than 300 people and forced the evacuation of 280,000 residents. Well, that's the end of our bulletin. From everyone here at France 24, please do stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.